Welcome to Season 2 of Vision 2222, the podcast where we get into conversations with interesting people who have valuable insights and ask them to go out on a limb and imagine what the world will be like in the future. We talk with leaders from industry, science, engineering, and the humanities, not only about what's happening around us today, but also what we might see if we jumped ahead in time, 20, 50, 100, or 200 years. In the season's finale, we will combine all the learnings and discoveries into a vivid painting of the world circa 2222. Vision 2222 is the brainchild of co-hosts Mikhail Gladkik, Amanda Chady, and John Marsh.
Hi, I am Mikhail. I'm a technologist and a science fiction author. My professional career provides me with a unique perspective on the technologies of the future. I'm working at the forefront of the fourth industrial revolution, advancing 3D printing, artificial intelligence, digital supply chain, and energy transition.
And I'm Amanda Chady, an entrepreneurial scientist mentoring startups in healthcare innovation and life sciences. And I advocate for ventures that are making positive changes towards a better future.
And I'm John Marsh. I've been working since 2008 as an administrator at a major research university in Houston, Texas, where I get a ringside seat to watch and support an amazing world of scientific and engineering innovation. Amanda will introduce our guest for this episode.
Carlos Zapata-Carratala completed his undergraduate training in physics at the University of Valencia and Imperial College London, and his master's in mathematical physics from the University of Cambridge. He also earned his PhD from the University of Edinburgh, and during his time in Edinburgh, Carlos worked as a research assistant and a teaching fellow in the School of Mathematics, while also running the Society for Multidisciplinary and Fundamental Research, SEMF or SEMF, and we'll talk a little bit about that in today's episode. And he is the co-founder and current president of this organization. Carlos is currently a research fellow and head of strategy at the Wolfram Institute, a recently established research institution dedicated to the investigation of the mathematical foundation of computation. He also hosts episodes on the Cephaloquim podcast, and you can find it on YouTube. The channel handle is at SEMF. And in his spare time, Carlos has many artistic and musical pursuits and has interests in kinetic art, cinematography, sound design, and competitive gaming. Welcome, Carlos, to the Vision 2222 podcast. And would you like to say anything before we begin our conversation?
Well, just to say I'm very happy to be here. Glad to be with you, John, Mikhail, and Amanda. It's a great pleasure and looking forward to the episode.
Great. So I want to begin by asking about the Society for Multidisciplinary and Fundamental Research, SEMF, and in particularly its approach to data and the advancement of knowledge. And I think it's actually a very important point to discuss because currently we are in the fourth industrial revolution or Industry 4.0, which basically refers to digital and smart transformation of manufacturing to improve and distribute products using advanced technologies such as AI, robotics, and the Internet of Things. But we should also take notice of new productivity tools for work and classroom learning that produces an enormous amount of data and analytics for students and teachers to work with. So I believe that we are living in an age of information overload. It can be overwhelming. So to begin, just first tell us a little bit about SEMF and how it addresses this problem I just spoke about having this enormous amount of data and not sufficient ways to actually gain knowledge from it, because that's the most important thing, right? Gain knowledge. And next, I want to hear about your vision about the fifth industrial revolution. Are you optimistic about what that would look like?
Okay, certainly. Yes, I will say a few words about SEMF or SEMF. This is a project that began as a student association back in Valencia, where I did my undergrad in physics a few years ago. And during the pandemic, it was a very pointed time of sort of reflection and inwards introspection, during the lockdowns and all the time that you got to be at home. And myself, with some other friends and colleagues, we decided, okay, why not we promote this student association to something a bit more larger scale and sort of with some more broader objectives. And so we were all coming from academia in different areas of academia, and we had all had some experiences that were not so great about disciplinary division and hyper focus on some areas and hyper specialization and things like that. Also the amount of productivity and the amount of publications that were coming out, and people having the stress to publish or perish, these kinds of things. So we got together and said, well, we'll try to create the environment that we would like to inhabit in a research social way, and that's basically what moved us to make this society. Nowadays, it's basically a place we are still in the process of setting it up in terms of our internal organization. We are now a registered nonprofit, and we are sort of in the process of having our internal systems in order. But at the moment, we are focused on basically gatherings. I mean, we are trying to get scientists together, we're trying to get intellectuals together, we're trying to get artists together, all manner of people who think about human affairs in a rational, analytical way. We're trying to get them under the same dome to a degree, and certainly interacting on fundamental questions. That's sort of the fundamental part of the acronym, multidisciplinary and fundamental. So we have a series of podcast episodes, which is at the moment a bit casual and a bit on and off. We have some conferences that we run. We have some summer schools. In our opinion, these are very successful. People from all over the world come to Valencia just on the basis of the call of the premise of the summer school, instead of some sort of prestige or established name or anything like that. So we're quite happy with that. And we have a very passionate group of people who are sort of early contributors to the project, and we are all quite excited and sort of working as we speak, behind the scenes. So then, addressing the question of living in an age of data overflow, I think actually we had a few slogans to begin the society. We had sort of a few main problems to address. A couple of them I've already mentioned: the hyper-specialization in academia and the sort of the productivity required to produce papers and sort of piecemeal research and all those kinds of things. But also one of them was the abundance of information and the sort of seeming lack of knowledge about that information. And so one of the ways that I would say we are trying to get past that, that sort of, we feel that it's sort of the result of a technological infancy that is now going into a sort of an early adulthood, or some adolescence in a way, in which data has gone from something that was kind of a byproduct of all the computational development in the last few decades to something that is now sort of the bread and butter of most industries, right? And so we now have sort of transitioned into this world where we have all this massive information and we have to decide what to do with it. So in our view, the way to sort of transition into a more knowledge-based era is to take the patterns that have always worked in scientific revolutions or in scientific progress in general, and sort of try to distill what's essential about them. And I'll give a single example that I always like to bring up to illustrate this point, which is the invention of calculus, the differential calculus and integral calculus in the 16th, 17th century. I always like to think that mechanics has been in history fairly, I mean, there were advancements throughout millennia, but if you compare Egyptian mechanics and physics to Middle Ages Europe mechanics and physics, there weren't that huge differences in terms of how things they could make, the tools they had, and so on. And then suddenly you have something happen in the 18th century and 19th century. It leads to the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. And so one way I like to understand this change was the influence of calculus in itself. It was an sort of an intellectual tool that was midway between logic, language, and geometry, and all those things had existed before for millennia, but it combined those elements in a very unique, novel way, and it provided essentially a mental tool, a mental piece of technology that was sort of ushering all these ideas. And so what I like to think of that is, okay, you can understand what is essential about the invention of ideas or the invention of sort of sets of mental tools and try to go after those. And obviously here areas of mathematics are relevant, areas of neuroscience are relevant, areas of psychology or psychophysics even in that particular example are relevant. But obviously also history, also history of design and all kinds of social context, political context, economic theory. So to us, the sort of multidisciplinary part comes because you need to have a sort of an integral view of the process, and so having all this information gathered in scattered in several parts of human creation doesn't help to create that integration, that integrated view. So one way we're trying to tackle that is getting the silos of information that are separate, try to make them more unified, or try to have them intercommunicate and spot the patterns that have worked. It's not a matter, I always try to emphasize that it's not just about having a bunch of people from different areas. That's sort of easy to do, but it's really important that you read the second word in the sort of acronym and you go fundamentals, that you have to spot the actual patterns. You need to go deep and to understand deeply what the patterns were doing at the time. And this is an example of calculus. It's very difficult if you don't understand calculus and you haven't studied mathematics to some degree. You don't have to be an expert. It's very hard to grasp what that makes very different from all the earlier techniques and sets of ideas that people had. So this is something that so this is just a mathematical example perhaps, but this really applies to almost any discipline. And so we need the expertise of the experts that know the content, but we also need the contextual information that many other experts will provide. And so there's really no favored profile. There's no, it's not that the physicist or the chemist or the painter or the economist is going to have a favored point of view or a sort of privileged vantage point. It's really that in the interaction, we need to find the patterns, and sort of that's almost by definition, the new patterns will lie outside of the charted area. I mean, almost by definition, right? So that's a little bit our philosophy in that. I want to make sure that this is Amanda sort of getting at the question more or less. And I know there's a second part about the next industrial.
Yeah, and I think I'll just, before you just go on to the fifth industrial revolution, I just think that it's really a nice holistic idea that you just put forth, with having this hub for these intellectuals to come together to spot the patterns that you talked about, and also that you mentioned that you can look at past advancements, right? Look into history, see where there were these big leaps in the advancements of technology existing at that time. And then I really like what you said about looking at or finding a new pattern. So there may be patterns that exist in whatever discipline, but coming together and finding new patterns is actually an important point for our listeners to take away. So yeah, I'll just let you jump back in. I would love to hear your vision of what the Industry 5.0 would look like. And, I'll add to that question. And do you think that it would probably happen in 40 years, 50 years? Or because the past Industry 1.0, 2.0, they took about maybe 80 years to happen. So do you think that Industry 5.0 is right around the corner, in the next 30, 40 years? Or do you think it's going to take a little bit longer? Let's hear your thoughts on that.
Yes. So I must admit, I don't have good intuitions on how to think about this, mostly because simply the definitions of 1.0, 2.0, these sort of stages of technology. Of course, there's a degree of arbitrariness to assign these steps naturally. I understand that there's sort of the milestones or the key advancements that define them and so on. So it's really quite difficult for me to imagine what would be the sort of the key advancement or the sort of qualitative change that will make you decide that now this is the fifth one. But I can certainly think about what the technology that we are ushering today would probably lead us to develop in the future. And I honestly, I don't want to commit to saying, oh, this is probably around the corner, or no, it's going to take a couple of centuries. It's really hard to tell from this point of view. But when I think about technology, I do believe strongly about how it shapes the entire development, the entire intellectual development of civilization. And I go back to the example of calculus because I think it's quite an interesting one. I think the moment you had calculus, something like calculus in the 17th century, you don't immediately see the impact of that development. I mean, the theory is pretty much established by the early 18th century, but you don't really see a big change in the sort of in civilization until you have the technological development that comes from it. So I would imagine that the tools that or the frameworks that we are constructing today, things like generative AI or sort of more natural language based computing and interfacing with computers and things like that. I think this is which I understand as mostly creating agents that are sort of computational and analytical aids to our natural analytical abilities. I think those are fundamentally going to change how we relate to our technological environment. And I think that if someone intuitively thinks of how people have interfaced with machines, even if you just confine to electrical machines mostly, it has been essentially a digital input-output sort of framework where you have maybe a keyboard or a set of strokes or maybe a graphical interface where you click on areas and so on. But you couldn't really converse with a computer. And now we are basically there. We have the ability to converse with a machine, and the machine is going to understand some parts of it, and maybe it's not going to be as rigorous or as deterministic as the digital counterparts. But there's certainly a new space of sort of cognitive activity that we are exploring now in this. And I think this is going to be absolutely revolutionary sometime down the line. I don't want to commit to say 20 years or I don't know, maybe 3 years, and this will be a big change.
It's a safe space, Carlos. You can just say.
Yeah. No, but
I know it's hard to predict.
Yeah, I think I would intuitively, it seems that we already have many of the systems that are going to have a deep impact. And I am actually myself involved in my work at the Wolfram Institute. We are hoping to develop one of such tools. It's not so much to do with the part of generative technology, but it's more to do with the computational interfaces. So where you essentially have interfaces that understand your input in a computationally informed way. So that means that you don't have to code programs. You actually have programs that are sort of humanly implemented. So you can, for example, write strokes like on a blackboard. We call it the Blackboard 2.0 or something like that, where you essentially just write strokes and draw what you would normally write down for mathematics, and the Blackboard actually understands and sort of takes in the mathematical information, and then that becomes sort of active in the Blackboard. So you can actually run computations just by writing symbols, and you don't have to use any specific programming language or be constrained by the grammar of the language and things like that. So I don't know. I mean, I know that some of these changes are going to happen very soon, and I imagine in the next decade we're going to see many changes. Some of them have already happened. I don't have to speculate. I mean, there was this big advancement in protein folding with AlphaFold and all this. To me, this is really one very clear example where there was clearly a different set of tools that had not been applied before that were making a big difference, and a long-standing computational problem was effectively solved almost in terms of efficiency. And this I think is going to be happening in many different areas and different degrees of sophistication in the next 10 years for sure. But I do believe that, speculating a bit more into the future, the way I like to understand the current state and what might be the key to the fifth industrial revolution is that we're effectively creating alien species to coexist with us. I mean, we are creating these cognitive beings, even the little black box of your whatever YouTube feed recommendations or those things are effectively cognitive beings. I mean, they have their personality in a way. Their designers don't know exactly what goes into their wiring in some sense. So, and obviously those are the very minimalistic ones. I mean, you take the big models and ChatGPT and all the big, all these big models. It's really hard to know what's going on inside of them. And so dealing with them and coexisting, obviously they have power to do things that we couldn't do before. So there's something to be gained in going and ushering the sort of computational abilities of these beings. But I call them beings because you're essentially going to interface with them as you would with an alien species that sort of learned translator technology to interface with English or Spanish or whatever, with some written text or spoken language. So I think that that's going to be a very different landscape where, machines can no longer be fully controlled, and it looks more like domesticated animals that are very intelligent and can have their sort of regime, but they can run wild sometimes. And, there's some risk of not knowing exactly what to expect. And, sometimes it might be, it's upset, and if you're not quite sure.
Right.
I think this is a very different change. And
yeah. And I could actually just see, if I were to paint a picture, it's almost like you have the human interaction with the technology that's going to come into play, right? How us humans interact. And then you have what you state as cognitive beings and the interaction among themselves. So I could definitely see those two things coming together for the industry 5.0.
Certainly, yes. And I think it would look much more like an ecosystem of interacting beings or sets of systems. Than today there is interaction for sure, but this interaction is very funneled in a way. We control very much sort of the input output contact points. And I think at the point where we have already all these language models that can interpret code and can rewrite code in different languages and things like that. I mean, that is not very far from the place where you would have entire systems that you can just translate entire other systems. And, the operating system of the logistics of some company can be interpreted by the language model of some, whatever, entertainment company. And, this interoperability is quite unprecedented, which is linked to intelligence and to the ability to spot patterns and all these things that we are familiar with now with these new technologies. But I think my view of the future is more of an ecological one. I feel like so far we've had more of a museum-like experience where you go out in the market and you say, okay, what do I need to get the job done? And you have a very efficient calculator for this particular problem. You have a very good apparatus to measure this and that. And you had all these very precise and refined pieces of technology. I think we're going into a future where it's going to look a lot more like an ecosystem of sort of some kind of beings in interconnection. And obviously we're going to have quite a lot of agency in to what degree our environment looks like that. And it's a debate whether we should go there, and and do we want to be in the hands of some kind of digital natural ecosystem that has a life of its own, and we are basically just making the most of it? Or do we want to be the masters of it and just have it completely controlled? I think it's a difficult conversation because there's a lot to be gained where all these systems sort of evolve as well, and we don't know exactly what they become, and as long as there are limits. And I think those are very interesting and important conversations. But I do see that the future is looking much more like ecologically rich instead of simply a collection of tools that are more and more efficient, which has been mostly the history until now.
Thank you.
No, thank you, Carlos, for this exciting view. This is obviously a lot to unpack.
It's exciting and scary.
Scary,
right?
And that's exactly what I was thinking. And we talked about the speed of advancement and the change, and looking back into the past and thinking it's progressing in a linear fashion, but it's not. It's exponential, and we don't think in exponential terms. We can't really. Our human experience, we're linear beings, right? We look at annual change, daily change. It's all repeats in the same manner. But in order to look into this technological change or structural change, we really need to start thinking exponentially. And what took 200-300 years, now it's taken 3 or 5, and it's accelerating. And that's what makes it exhilarating and scary. I agree with that. And Carlos, thank you for everything you said about math and the foundational role of math. You've spent years studying math and mathematical physics, as I understand, and this happens to be my academic background as well. So thank you for that.
My pleasure.
You are currently in this multi-project transdisciplinary research program called Arity Science, ARITY, and our listeners can find it at www.arity.science. Can you tell us more about this program and about the projects that you're most excited about? In what ways do you think these projects will benefit our society in the future? And to begin with, please tell us more what arity stands for, because I don't think our listeners know.
Yes. Well, thanks for the question. I would say this is a certain change of gears from thinking about the far future of what technology is taking us, and I think arity science is a fairly humble fairly humble project. Arity is a word I chose for marketing reasons mostly. It's a sufficiently distinct sounding word that can be used as a distinctive name. But arity is derived from words like binary, ternary, and so on. So it's this uses of binary involving two things, ternary involving three things, quaternary involving four things, and so on. So arity is the term that has been used already in mathematics for some time, mathematics, logic, and computer science, to designate the number of inputs that some function or some relation has. So you normally would say something like a binary relation, like, I know this person, or a ternary relation, like these three species are independent in an ecosystem, or something like that. And you would say that arity is sort of the number that you assign to those. So you would say your friendship with your childhood friend is a arity 2 relation, and you would say that these three species in an ecosystem is an arity 3 relation, for example. And so arity is a very simple term. It just refers to that. It's really that there's no sophistication behind the word. It's just a way to designate the number of things involved in a relation. But the project is to do with generally higher arity structures. So in the history of modern science, and by modern I mean essentially 20th century onwards, there has been a very obvious bias towards what we could call pairwise or binary structures. And the easiest way to visualize this is to look at the success of network theory. Network theory, some people would agree that goes all the way back to Gauss and to graph theory and so on. But in reality, it really was in the 20th century that we start to see applications of network theory and the growth of network theory and complex network theory and things like that in the mid 20th century, and all the analysis of communication networks, transportation networks, social networks, etc., that has really taken off in the last, let's say, 50 years or so. And if you look at the vast amount of literature on this topic, you would see that the structure that the entire analysis is based on is that of a network, of course, as the name suggests. And the network is a collection of nodes and a collection of pairwise links between those nodes. So in recent years, this is not my own original contribution, but in recent years, there has been a move towards what's called higher order networks, which basically introduce higher order connections in between the nodes. So you not only have two-way relationships in your network, but you also have higher order and higher multi-way relations in your networks. And the best example is what I mentioned before, is, for example, ecological relations. You could have more than two species that are in symbiosis, and they don't have any sort of pairwise relations. Or sometimes even social relationships are a good example. When you have a group of friends, you don't necessarily have friendship with each pair of the people, but if you all meet for the same purpose, you have that. Another very clear example for people more in academia is co-authorship, right? You write a paper with a set of people. That doesn't mean that you've written a paper with each individual in that group of people, right? You have a co-authorship with a group of authors of the paper, and you don't necessarily have that with the pairs. So this is in a way, it's a very silly, almost a mundane observation to include this higher order relations. It's in a way, nature is higher order naturally. There's nothing in nature seems to be profoundly binary that you shouldn't go higher. But our mathematics has been more biased to be binary in the last 150 years or so. And so I was shocked to find out a few years ago, and this is coming back from my days of PhD studies in mathematical physics and differential geometry, I got into this idea of higher order arity and higher order mathematics, and I found there was a lack of literature on the mathematics of higher order relations. And there is some, but there's certainly a gap in the literature for that. So the project started as a way to develop or sort of a will to develop the mathematics of those higher order relations. And there have been several efforts, and I'm not the only one in attempting this. Arguably, we are not too many that we are doing this. It's not a hugely popular topic. I think, understandably, because it's very hard to think about. It's not intuitive to really properly think about higher order relations, as I will mention in a minute. But it's mostly the main goal is to develop the mathematics to understand these higher order relations. And so the key idea that listeners can have in their minds when listening to this is the example of ternary relations that cannot be broken down into binary relationships. So I would prompt them to, because this is audio based, I would prompt them to go and search for Borromean rings. This is a structure of 3 interlocking rings, and they are geometrically disposed in space in such a way that if you cut one of them open, the other 2 are also loose, and you can untangle the lock. So you can clearly chain to rings, and that's like a chain. You can have this pairwise connection, but you can also, when you have 3 of them, you can chain them in a all pairwise, or you can dispose them in space in such a way that they are in this Borromean configuration. And it turns out that this Borromean configuration is fundamentally ternary. You cannot break it down into binaries. So it's a very sort of visual, clear example of that. And so that's very intuitive for people to understand. But not only is it intuitive, we also have a project at the moment with some physicists in the University of Edinburgh who are looking at genomes of some bacteria and genomes of some in mitochondrial genomes as well, where we are studying the knot theory structure, so basically the tangled structure of circular DNA in those genomes. And it is an open question at the moment if those DNA loops are tangled in this higher order configurations. It is known that they form links, they form the basic chain links. This is known, but we don't know if they are arranged in higher order configurations, such as the Borromean links that I just mentioned. And we don't know what biological significance what those things could be. So my project is contributing to that research by providing the mathematical tools to be able to detect, to begin with, the presence of those higher order connections in circular DNA in some genomes. So we are sort of far away from the thing itself, because we are dealing with abstract mathematics and the analysis of structures, topological structures, and so on. But at the same time, we're quite close to the problem. We are trying to build the mathematics that will be useful for the physicists making the measurements with the electron microscope images of these genomes. So I would say that's one of the most exciting applications. And another exciting application that I have in mind is neuroscience. I was in Vienna last summer in the network science conference, and I met a neuroscientist that was looking for ways to parse hypergraph data. So hypergraph is higher order network data from brain imaging time series. And so we had a conversation where they said, we now can see that if we bundle our brain activity regions by pairs, we can, and we do the usual brain network analysis of the patterns, we can spot whether a patient has a mental disorder or not. But they could not discern whether they had depression or anxiety or etc. So what they realized is that if they grouped brain activity areas by trios, just trios, not even higher order, they could discern, for example, the difference between depression, anxiety, and I think it was obsessive compulsive disorder. I think some more refined forms of mental health issues. So that to me was a very striking example of, okay, when you consider higher order relations, you can practically actually discern things. So what they came to me saying, but what we need is a mathematical tool that allows us to process all the information that we've gathered. We have this information, and we need the mathematical tools to effectively do statistics on this and reduce the data efficiently and so on. So that's what the project is providing. We are trying to develop the sort of mathematical formulas, almost, if you want to reduce it to the most concrete thing, for them to use and do the analysis. So yeah, very exciting topics.
Thank you, Carlos, for sharing this. Indeed, it's very exciting. I have 2 follow-up questions on both of these projects you mentioned. So first, on this circular DNA and genome structures, if we just speculate, I understand it's research and we're just starting to look at it, but if we just speculate on this topic, do you think this might be the way to store some higher level information in those structures where we didn't really have access to yet?
Yeah, I love that question, because that was my when I had the meeting with the physicists in Edinburgh, when we first noticed that this could be a project and a collaboration. That was my first comment afterwards. I said, so here's the possibility that life has discovered a topological code on top of the genetic code. And this, to me, this is the most exciting hypothesis that we have, the working hypothesis that we have, is that clearly life has discovered, biological life, evolution has discovered, quote unquote, discovered, I don't know if that's controversial with some listeners, has discovered the topology of a chain, right? The topology of a sequence where the nitrogen bases come in a certain sequence, and that has information, and that's the basis of the genetic code that we all know now. And the question is, has evolution discovered the topological code of knots of those circular DNAs, or even the proteins that they encode? Because there's also a lot of evidence of knotted proteins. There's a big bank of, now actually connected to my comment about AlphaFold and the protein folding problem. Thanks to this, there has been a lot of progress in finding these knotted proteins and so on. But well, that's just besides the point. But yes, it's the most exciting hypothesis for me now, that it might be the case that biology or evolution has found these discrete ways of storing information. And the reason why I think your question makes a lot of sense, and I am personally quite excited about it, is that when you think about the properties of the genetic code, it is something that is discrete, it is finite, it is consistent, it is resilient, it has redundancy, it can be replicated, and so on. These are all properties that knots, if you imagine of proteins being knotted and forming links with specific topology, those will have. And there's effectively a periodic table of knots that you can, there's a very sort of concrete theory of knots. And what's most exciting is that it is actually quite well known, there are proteins that perform exactly the kind of operations that topologists normally describe with knots. So, for example, crossing threads and things like that. There is I think it's a topoisomerase 2B, if I remember correctly. It's a protein that takes two strands of DNA and effectively opens one up and then lets the other through and then glues it back. And so it changes nothing in the sequence of the two strands, but it allows the strands to cross one through the other, which is effectively, as the mathematicians in the audience might recognize, one of the Reiter-Meister moves of knots. But so it's very exciting that clearly your cells in your body are constantly performing knot operations, and they seem to know about knot structures and knotted structures, and it is an open question whether they are using that as a basis for information storage or some kind of metagenetic or paragenetic code storing. So it's very exciting. I have no answers. These very early stages. We don't really know, because we don't even know if there are statistically significant present of higher order knotting structures in this genomes. But I think the possibility is very real. We've studied the energetics of them a little bit, and we know that they are not energetically unfavorable. So they are, at least they are not very prohibitive in terms of how much energy it would cost to form them. So it's very plausible that they might exist, and it's one of the very exciting prospects of this project.
Now, this is very fascinating, and I understand it's early stages. I'm really curious to learn in a few years where this research leads, and
I hope so. Yes.
What amazing discoveries will result. And my second question on this neuroscience synaptic connections you mentioned, which is also quite interesting, and this might probably be some controversial ground as well. But in the recent research in the studies of psychedelics effect on the brain, it's been discovered that psychedelics actually facilitate this higher level connections and interconnectivity between brain regions from neuroscience perspective. And there's an open question and debate among scientists what is actually happening and why, and where does it lead. So do you think that this interconnections that you're finding, higher level connections, that could lead to a new maybe level or a different level of cognition modes in our brains, and whether psychedelics might in some way facilitate that interconnectivity.
I love your question again. I mean, you have an ability to really ask the ideal questions for this, because so I have to, and this connects with our previous topic of SEMF in my society, because last summer we ran a summer school, which is our sort of centerpiece of the calendar. And I have to mention one of our contributors, one of our speakers in the summer school was Aline Viol, who is a researcher who is currently at CISA, Italy. And she gave a presentation exactly on that point. And I mentioned this to signify that there's clearly research ongoing at the moment on this, and there's activity very much in the present on this topic. So she was precisely talking about how the effects, I think in her case, it was LSD, she's involved in some studies in Brazil with some early legalized LSD and clinical studies of LSD to do with creativity and the different perceptions of creativity and so on. But she was a neuroscientist at the end, so she had all this brain activity data, and she was showing clear differences in particular, for those in the audience who know about the technicalities, about entropy measures of the networks, and they were showing the differences in entropy for pairwise networks and the difference in entropy for higher order networks. And by difference, I mean from non-LSD and LSD sort of states. And it was clear that the entropy measures of the higher order networks were showing much more clearly that the brain was on a relatively high dose of LSD. So that in itself is quite, in my opinion, quite promising. And it's also quite intuitive for the abundant research that there is on reported experience for psychedelic use, which, especially for LSD, tends to be, I feel like there's connectivity that previously didn't happen, and there's this flexibility of ideas and so on. So this is very consistent with the fact that if you collapse all your connections to pairwise and everything reduced to a network, you probably can see something because you can still see more connectivity. But if you can track multi-connectivity patterns, it's probable that you're going to have a much more efficient way to detect, because things are going to change at a much more discrete level than the sort of the more statistical level of having to project down to pairwise. Because this is something that should be said. Anytime you have a higher order network, you can always project it down to a pairwise, where if something is related to a collection of nodes, you just write that many pairwise nodes between them. So that reduction is effectively what they were measuring traditionally. And then what they did is they measured some higher order connectivity, and they realized that showed much more effectively and much more statistically significant differences in entropy, which can be thought of as sort of complexity of the network, or distributed connectivity of the network, or something like that. So yeah, it's very, very interesting.
No, thank you, Carlos. Appreciate it.
Yeah, this is the questions you're going through right now are way more interesting than the one I'm going to ask. I just love the way the direction of this conversation is going. At the same time, this is an almost age-old problem or challenge that we've faced. There's for a long time been a sort of tension between the need in science, for example, to specialize in order to be able to dig deeply for understanding, versus the tendency to over-specialize, having a dampening effect on creativity of the researchers. So let's talk about how to connect the disciplines, how you do this when you're conducting your SEMF activities, for example. How do you create more opportunities to organize collective meetings for people from specialized fields? But then when you do that, what is the creative process? What does it look like if you have a synthetic biologist, mathematical physicist, say a graphic designer, and a teacher in one room? How does that work?
Yeah, I think I can answer mostly with what has worked before, and instead of theorizing and sort of spitballing some rough ideas, I would say that what we have done, and I think it has been quite successful, was especially in the very early stages of SEMF, we tried to do these online events because it was sort of around the time of the pandemic. It was, stay at home recommendation. So we did everything online. So we decided, by we, I mean the core people that work at the association, that we are around late PhD, early postdoc sort of stage of researchers. We got together and we thought, okay, what are interesting questions that we have, sort of scientific or intellectual questions that we have. And so we basically brainstorm for a little bit, and then we talk about patterns that we've observed. So for the very, very first one that we organized a couple of years ago, we thought of the concept of number in a universal sense. And this is going to sound very perhaps almost childish, the fact that you say, okay, number, of course, because it's the first thing you learn about mathematics, and mathematics is everywhere. So of course, number is going to be something that unifies a lot of people. But I think our approach was a bit different, because it was coming to the concept of number from, going at very specific questions about numbers. And I personally was inspired by one conversation I had with well, he would like to be called phytophilosopher. See, he works on plant cognition in a lab actually not far from where I am right now in Spain, in Murcia. And then his name is Paco Calvo. He's just written actually a book called Planta Sapiens, for those interested. I think it's a very interesting summary of the states of the state of affairs in the discipline of plant cognition. And so I was having a conversation with him, one of our sort of intellectual podcast kind of episodes, and there was some comment about plants keeping track of instances of sort of integer numbers, and I thought, okay, so what is that structure? Is that some kind of chemical refractory sort of dynamics, or is it something like counting, like we do, or what animals do? And he said, well, we don't really know, but we know that it's not just chemical, because there's a degree of learning involved, and there's memory and so on. And so, that got me thinking, okay, so what kinds of systems count? What are the things that count in the world? Obviously, we count in some sense. A computer maybe counts in some other way, but animals also count in some other way. So we got down to those questions, and we basically, ramified into, is the world continuous or discrete? How do you assign a number to a scene that really has no discreteness to it, and you have to sort of coarse grain and this? So we had all these ramification questions from the pure idea of, how do we get numbers out of our experience in our sort of environment? And we had an event called Numerous Numerosity. That was the name of our first conference. And we talked about the numerous ways in which you can talk about numerosity. Numerosity being the sort of property of an experience in which you can assign an integer value to it. And so we had anything from philosophers of cognition to pure mathematicians that were number theorists and sort of working in arithmetic and theory improvers. We had Stephen Wolfram talk about, his hypothesis that the universe is computational fundamentally, and it's just running some discrete computational rules. We had physicists talk about, fundamental physics and how the laws of physics seem to be in some way discrete and know about discreteness. But we also have, and perhaps the most interesting aspect of the conference was that we had a bunch of neuroscientists and cognitive scientists that were talking about mathematical cognition, and they were talking about how children and other animals learn to count and so on. And to me, the key to the success of this conference was summarized by Kevin Bussard, who is a mathematician at Imperial College, who was one of the speakers that talked at the very end of the conference. And he said, before he gave his talk, he said, I must admit, the first time I was contacted to give a talk at this conference, I thought this was just some very dubious venue. I didn't have any intention to even contribute, but I reluctantly accepted. And then throughout the week, I've been completely thrilled to realize that I was learning from a cognitive archaeologist that we had from, for example, the University of Colorado. That they presented the history of number systems and how they developed in early humans and in prehistory and all those things. And so having a pure mathematician that had never thought about, or in his words, had never gone outside of the maths department in some sense, in his own words saying, I was shocked that during this week I've covered more intellectual ground than in many years that I've been thinking about these things. I mean, those words to us meant a lot, and for us that was kind of the recipe for success. That we had thought hard about some deep questions. We had no idea who we're going to invite, what format of the event it was going to be, but we really had sort of a serious time of thinking about this deep questions of what really. Is the universe really discrete or continuous? Are numbers invented, or are these some pattern that we're discovering and as we go out? So these questions are, in some sense almost childish, but if you're a mature researcher and you're in a community of sort of very enthusiastic young scientists, these questions can get quite energized. And I think that was the key to the success, that the questions, everyone, in fact, the way we approached our speakers was mostly saying, look, we have this set of questions, we're going to get lots of interesting profiles from many areas to address them from their point of view. And everyone was, okay, this sounds like a great opportunity. So they didn't want to miss it. So I think that will be a big part of it, is just discovering, to summarize, after what I said, I would say that a key to having multidisciplinary gatherings and to have this conversation is that, again, referring back to the acronym that we use, multidisciplinary and fundamental, is that you point to something fundamental. You go somewhere that is far away so that everyone has to look away from their field and so walk in that same direction, right? And so that's sort of the intuitive feeling I get, that if you point to a sufficiently interesting area, even if it's covered by traditional disciplines in some capacity, but everyone can understand the depth of the problem or the question. I think that's a recipe for success. It's very likely that you're going to have engagement, and you have these mathematicians that basically told us, we've been converted from last week. We didn't have any faith it was going to go anywhere, and now I had this sort of transformative experiences. So yeah, we're quite confident that's a big part of it.
That must have been that must have given you and the other organizers a huge sense of satisfaction to hear
Absolutely.
that from obviously someone who has a lot of respect in the business.
Yes, absolutely. No, thanks for that comment, because we really did feed off this sort of reports in the two conferences that we've organized. We organized numerosity 2 years ago and spacious speciality last year. So that last year was the topic of space and shape and geometry and all these kinds of things. And we had reports of this nature in both of them, where we had very established senior researchers saying to us, we were not very sure about how this was going to go, but in the end, we had a really great time, and we've benefited. We've learned a lot, and when you hear that this very established professors are learning a lot from an event that you've organized, I mean, that's all we can ask for. There's really nothing else we can really aspire to do as a society and as a gathering sort of organization.
Well, if you were able to put together more opportunities for collective meetings, obviously you want to continue this series that you've established already.
Mm-hmm.
What would how would you shape some additional efforts in that direction of gathering the people from many disciplines together?
Yeah, I think one of the aspects that we have in mind, so one of the ways to do it is, as I said, by looking at fundamental problems or questions that go sort of deep into the topics. But I think also there's a part of community building that really almost transcends just the individual. And so many times in those kinds of events, or even when we meet for fun, because many of us are just friends, we end up talking about themes that are very close to what this podcast is about, and the future of civilization, and how we are going to develop as a community and as a global society, and so on. So obviously topics like climate change, or how to live sustainably and things like that, and how to project, and those are very hot topics that are usually sort of in the conversation. So another way that I personally like to think is an effective way to get multidisciplinary gatherings is precisely by having very difficult challenges to solve. For example, things like climate change and how to live sustainably. These are topics that are often in the conversations that we have, sometimes not directly related to the organization of the society itself, but these are things that are quite present. And one thing that I can say as an example is this was a sort of pet project of mine at one point was that I wanted to have I'm sure many people in the audience will be familiar with role-playing games, or pen and paper, sit down and play role-playing games. I haven't played that many myself, but I did play some when I was younger. And so I was thinking at some point, how would you have a role-playing game that involves people with actual technical skills and technical abilities, not just the knowledge of some game rules or something like that in fantasy world, and you would have them interact in a meaningful way. So the way I like to think of it is that you would sit down and try to accomplish something very difficult. Obviously, you are not going to execute on the plan, but you would try to think about it. And my personal idea was to do how to colonize the nearest habitable exoplanet, for example. Right? Imagine that that's the problem. We know there are some exoplanets. There are a few tens of light years away. How do we go about colonizing them? I mean, it's a actual problem that has a technically there might be a solution. It might be practically impossible, but physically it seems reasonable that that's possible. And so when thinking about that, the role playing aspect of it will be that you would sit down a team of people, and each one will assume the role of, I'm going to be the officer for how to make sure that the society that goes there thrives and humans are alive throughout the trip, and they have a happy life, and there's no chaos, and you can sustain. So you need to think about politics and economics and psychology and sociology and all those things. But obviously you also have to compute and calculate the routes and the trajectory. You need astrophysicists, you need mathematicians, you need and you obviously need to sustain an ecosystem in some ways. You need biologists so that you can have a cycle of food and so on, and biochemistry and all those things. So I thought of something that is very difficult to accomplish is going to involve many different people, but there's one singular objective. It's like we need to get some generations down the line some basic constraints. Humans have to be awake and alive for all the duration of the trip or something, some basic constraints. But we have to get there. So I think that's another way in which you really manage to get this sort of confluence of profiles, right? When there's a singular objective.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating idea. I think that will be I think it'll illustrate a lot about what you're trying to accomplish by putting one of those together and pushing it through the whole process of a game. I wouldn't have thought of the ability to use game engagement in that way. That's really very cool to think about.
So, Carlos, you mentioned something, and
Yeah.
I have to ask a follow-up question. As a mathematician and intellectual, you're involved in philosophy of math, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned something about whether the numbers are discovered or created. In other words, are the numbers the fundamental part of the universe or of the reality, or is this something that we humans create to deal with reality, and this is how our brains work? So what do you think? What's your take on it?
Yeah, well, I would like to answer in a very sort of institutional way and say my answer to that question is I had to organize an entire conference to give answer to it. So but that's a cop-out answer, of course. My personal thoughts. I think there are some questions that have to do with philosophy, and the way I think of philosophy is almost like aesthetics of thought, right? It's almost the aesthetics of the mind. I don't want to diminish the work of philosophers, because I think they many times are actually in a very multidisciplinary enabling way. They sort of bring ideas up and they steer up the pot, so to speak, and it's very important what they're doing. But I think that when you try to pledge alliance to some of these sort of beliefs, or are you a Platonist, or do you think in reality, are you a realist, are you idealist, all these things, I feel like that's a bit more like almost like choosing your football team. I'm from Spain, and here I was with friends last night. I'm not a particular fan of football, but they all do the same thing. They all kick the ball, they all run around the field, and they have very expensive international players. And so, but some people prefer Barca and some people prefer Real Madrid. And so it's like, I feel like there's a degree of that. There's a degree of some preference that is quite subjective and quite accidental. But I would say with the case of numbers, I personally, if you ask me right now, I do have the intuition that numbers are emergent from the sort of informational flows that happen between reality at large and the cognitive system that is sort of more compressed and concentrated in a brain or a nervous system and a body and so on. I feel like numbers are sort of appear naturally in that process, but at the same time, it's clear that the the nucleation, if I can use the word, of matter happens, and there's sort of chunks of things that are kind of blips in a detector that happen naturally, right? So in some sense, they are ready to be detected as discrete bits of information, right? So I don't know. I mean, there are days where, I really wake up like a Platonist and I feel like, the universe is just pre-coded and is just unfolding. And there are other days where which I guess is the most days, where I wake up and I think the universe is this big mystery of a mess of matter that happens to have a lot of patterns that are discernible. And this is, as Einstein famously said, is the most incomprehensible thing about the universe, is that it's comprehensible in some sense. So that's kind of my default mind state, that there's sort of a mess and we put some order in it and we assign and that's what a mathematician does. I like to think of mathematics as the activity in which you are reducing the complexity into the bins of simplicity that are relevant to capture part of the phenomena, right? I would describe that as mathematics broadly. And I think you can only really have that view when you're thinking that mathematics is flexible enough that that your particular cognitive being is playing some role. But there are very important voices in the community that have diverging opinions on this, and I think that all these things are very valid. I'm not a belligerent materialist or anything like that, or I don't, I'm not going to go after someone's ontology because it doesn't involve matter as an important thing. I don't know. I don't have strong feelings in that sense.
No, and I appreciate it, Carlos. And it's a debate that spans millennia.
Absolutely.
Philosophers and scientists, it's fascinating to talk about it and look at it from different perspectives, right?
Indeed.
Yeah. Thank you.
That's very cool. Just going back a moment in
Sure.
the questions that we have kind of lined up, there's a terminology thing that I think would be interesting for us to get a little more clearly. There is a word called transdisciplinary, which is kind of intuitive, but then there's a related term, interdisciplinary. What are the differences between those, and how does that play into your efforts that we've been describing?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the question. As a pre-word, I would say many times we thought that we want to communicate that we are a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, adisciplinary, antidisciplinary. So we want to basically choose your prefix disciplinary society. But I think the two that you chose are particularly important, and they actually point at the two things I was referring earlier. So I would say transdisciplinarity is simply this sort of ideal situation where there is something that is beyond what is known, so that people have to look out, and from several areas you all have to look out and say, well, where are we going? What do we need to know? That takes us out of our own area of expertise. And interdisciplinarity, I would say, is simply the phenomenon that you have in meaningful interaction between disciplines, and where you have sufficiently separated cultures and traditions of thought that can be called disciplines in some sense. And then when a project requires the expertise of those more or less unrelated traditions of thought, then you can say there's an interdisciplinary collaboration going on. So I think interdisciplinary collaboration is a fairly common and widespread phenomenon, which, even just the structure of a company, if you think about it,
right,
any commercial company, it's a big interdisciplinary effort where there's a specialization, there's sort of teamwork dynamics that you have to cooperate with others and so on. I would say transdisciplinary refers to something that is a bit more, in a sense, a bit more important to us, or a bit more sort of desired in a way. It's sort of aspirational. That's the word I want to use. Something more aspirational. Transdisciplinary really refers to when there is a question that is fundamental enough, or is universal enough, or there's a singular objective that is hard enough, as we said earlier, with setting one objective and one big mission, that it just transcends the disciplines, and therefore the use for transdisciplinary, right? Like you like to think that you're transcending the fact that you think in terms of disciplines, and it's more about we have to do something that kind of doesn't know about the disciplines, and so disciplines are sort of artificial there.
So it's terminology that relates directly to the earlier part of this set of questions.
Absolutely.
Diving into the philosophical background is equally important. So I'm not in any way denigrating what you and Mikhail were talking about. It's very interesting. I think Amanda's up next.
All right. Fascinating conversations so far, Carlos. I'm enjoying and learning a lot. So this next set of questions, I'm actually going to pull a little bit about what you spoke with about with John and how to live sustainably, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to tie it into the first set of questions we had with the industry 4.0, 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. In particularly, I want you to pay attention to the connection between humans, nature, and design. And the reason that I'm kind of meshing these two topics together, sustainability and then industrial revolution, is that I feel like people really don't grasp how much this changes the way we live. The houses we buy, the cars we drive, where we send our kids to school, the roads we drive on. So these advancements is directly related to our quality of life, right? So looking at sustainability and looking at design, we go on a vacation, we see beautiful things in nature. So you can just sit in fascination and look at how a spider, is weaving a web, or how these termites build these humongous termite mounds. And so there's this intricacy of design, and then there's intelligence. And then you introduce humans' consciousness and how we interact with the environment, how we interact with nature. And the question I want to get to is, how can humans use this transdisciplinary approach to create beautiful things, functional things, but they are alongside nature in a sustainable way? Because I think this has a huge impact on our future, right? And right now there's all these problems that we're causing: climate change, deforestation, there's flooding, there's so much environmental disasters that are directly related to human actions. So can you tell us a little bit about how you think using this transdisciplinary approach can help humans live alongside nature in the future? And can we reverse any of these bad things that we humans are doing?
Yes, well, certainly. I used the example earlier of saying that a good way to get a transdisciplinary effort is to have a very difficult goal. Well, this is a perfect example for that. If there ever was a difficult goal, this is one for sure. So yes, I think, I like to think more than before addressing how transdisciplinarity can be helpful for this, which I think I can effectively write off by saying any sufficiently difficult human endeavor is going to involve transdisciplinarity in this sense, as I just talked about earlier. So just refer to my previous answers on this. But what I do think is something that you did mention, or at least alluded to. I think it's very important that when we look at nature and we think of how we live in nature, I think it's important to realize that we are nature in a sense. We obviously like to think, as cognitive beings, we separate ourselves from the environment, and that's very, effective for adaptation and so on. But we are nature, and I think that having sort of a systems approach to our role in nature is really what changes the perspective. And of course, having a systems perspective doesn't lead to a better future in a more humanistic sense or in a sustainable way, but it gives you the tools to do so if you so decide. I would say, or at least give you better tools than some intuitive production mentality that we've had for the last few hundred years. So I think human existence, again, I'm sort of walking out of my comfort zone here as a pure mathematician, as a physicist, but I would say that humans have lived. Humans are just ill-equipped to think in terms of a civilization-wide structure. I think that the civilization structures that have emerged are very sort of second order for what a human being is and thinks, and therefore we need to make the most of our abstract thinking and our abstract and ability to structure abstract dynamics in societies to make this happen. And of course, in the past, this has been manifested as, all the political regimes and the religious traditions, and even today with, the human rights or the UN or whatever you like to think as big, broad organizations. But I think that something that will really make a difference would be in studying studying or considering humans as part of the system in a dynamical sense, meaning you are not so much thinking of agency, but thinking of evolution in a way. So we obviously like to think in terms of agency because there is causal relation between what we do and what happens. If we release, radioactive materials, we're going to kill animals, we're going to harm people and other species and whatnot. Clearly, there has been an impact of industry and emissions in sort of global warming and all these kinds of things. And these are patterns that are very well established, and there's no debate there. But I think what we don't really grasp, but I think when I see conversations about climate change and some even technical conversations about climate change, I see a bit of an evolutionary perspective missing. And then I think that many times we're thinking, okay, humans are this entity and we are on Earth as this separate entity, and we have to make sure that we put in measures to revert, or we control ourselves not to emit so much, or we develop the clean energies and so on. And obviously this is fantastic. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. But what I'm missing in terms of, especially if we're thinking of the year 22, as this podcast is suggesting, if we are looking that far into the future, I would say that we have to think in terms of evolutionary dynamics and in terms of systems biology, systems thinking in general. I think that's the way to go. So that obviously requires expertise of the different parts of the system that are involved to describe the relevant variables and to give the right parameters of the models and things like that. And that is just a natural interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary eventually effort if you want to solve it.
Right. And so you think that this evolutionary aspect, can you just reframe that a little bit for our listeners? When you talk about think in terms of evolution, not more than, what humans are doing, the impact right now, what exactly are you talking about when you're saying think in terms of evolution?
Yes. I mean, two things. I mean, explicitly evolution in terms of the species, of the human species and the species that we are in direct interaction with, like all the domesticated plants and animals that we use in some way or another. I mean, we have been affecting evolution directly quite explicitly for the last 20,000 years in human history, and I mean, genetic engineering didn't start with the genome. I mean, genetic engineering started with domestication, right? It's kind of the beginning of that. And so if we think about many of the issues about sustainability in many parts of the world, it mostly has to do with how we use this species with which we have this ecological or very narrow ecological interactions, which we don't think of crops as an ecological interaction, but they are. I mean, we are two species and we're establishing some kind of symbiosis or some kind of relationship that makes us both live on the same area and we both thrive in a way, right? So similarly with some animal species and things like that. So I mean it in a very explicit sense, obviously also in terms of human evolution, human biology. I mean, this is not to get into the sort of Pandora's box of transhumanism and sort of expanding human capabilities and things like that for human genetics itself. But that's also perhaps part of the problem. I wouldn't say the timescales are that aligned, because the timescales for human evolution, even engineered human evolution, are probably longer than the ones that are relevant for sustainability in the planet right now. So I wouldn't say that's too relevant, but it's still a question. And the other way in which I mean ecologically, or sorry, evolutionarily, is to think of the interaction with nature in an evolving way, because I think it's very easy, especially when you see the sort of more political part of climate action and things like that. It's very easy to have, and it's necessary to in a way to reduce the complexity of nature, as nature is this thing that it's kind of static and it's doing its own thing, and it's and we appear and we disrupt it and we litter and contaminate and destroy and so on. And I think, I mean, I am the first to agree that when we go into an ecosystem and we pollute and many species die and so on, that there's distraction there. There's loss of life, there's loss of value. I personally agree with that. But at the same time, I am not one to quickly just dismiss the fact that we could possibly affect an ecosystem to improve it in a way that will be dramatically changed in a way, but in some sense will be improved in some sense. I don't know. I don't want to just rule out the possibility that we have the ability to actually influence our environment in a way that we could all agree at a certain point that it's actually good. And obviously everyone is, at least not many years ago, agreed that having huge crops and growing a single species of plants to feed ourselves was a good change. I mean, that was a dramatic ecological change in those areas, and we all agreed, okay, this is a good thing. So this is perhaps more of an intellectual position, not so much a political one, but I think it's important not to rule out the possibility that we can evolve with our environment to arrangements that are not intuitive and that we can't quite see just by seeing ourselves seeing nature as a static sort of birds chirping, everything is sort of running idyllically in the world, and we come in as the destructors, the pure production based sort of industry, sort of gray influence. I think that is a picture that is used a lot, and I see why, because there's probably a first order approximation that is quite powerful to communicate the problem. But I feel like I would value the presence of more conversation along the lines of coevolution, human genetic proactive genetic engineering, but in an evolutionary sense, meaning that you are sort of controlling how ecosystems are going to evolve, not just changing one species or introducing or destroying everything but one species and things like that. So I think that's the sort of the more complex way of addressing the coexisting with an ecosystem, right?
Right. And the way I see it, almost, along the lines that you just described, is that you have, I believe, this equilibrium in nature that's existing. And then you have human involvement, human interaction. And I feel like over the centuries of human existence, there's always like human activity, there's changes to the climate, changes to the earth. And then somehow I feel like there is some moment of restored equilibrium. But the question is, would there be a tipping point eventually where human action is so drastic that Mother Nature, or just nature in general, is not able to cope or change in a way that's still beneficial for us humans, right? So I could see your point, but then you wonder, is there a tipping point eventually where human action really changes our future? And maybe there is something in the future that can drastically change the way that we live on this planet. Well, besides some natural disaster, of course.
Yes. I can certainly imagine tipping points or actions that will be performed by humans or by civilization that will effectively render the ecosystem completely lifeless or effectively lifeless. And I'm thinking about nuclear war or some really drastic outcomes that would certainly create those situations. And hopefully we don't have to think too much about those, because if those do happen, then there's nothing to do. But hopefully I think those are fairly unlikely to happen. I would say, if I look back, and again, this is outside of my area of expertise, I don't want to sort of think up some interesting words to say and then have them exposed as if this is some important knowledge about the future of humanity. But if I look back at humanity and what Homo sapiens has done in the past, it's almost a cautionary tale for what we are experiencing now. Because, when you see the way in which Homo sapiens tended to not always, obviously, but in some cases where there was sufficient population, the way Homo sapiens tended to live was really sort of exhausting the possibilities. This doesn't mean that they sort of completely consumed resources or something like that, but they normally exhausted the possibilities of the ecosystem, and they went for, if they were hunting a certain kind of megafauna, they would usually drive them to extinction, because they didn't have a notion that these animals were finite and they had their own ecological dynamics, that they were disrupted very actively, because we were very good at hunting and tactically cornering all these animals and so on. And I think the tale of if listeners are curious about when Homo sapiens arrived in America and the sort of evolutionary records of and extinction records of the megafauna, so these are the big animals, the big mammals from the Ice Age in especially North America, it's quite astonishing. I mean, it's basically there's an extremely strong correlation between humans settling in ecosystems and megafauna disappearing. It's almost 1-to-1. It's very, very strong correlation in North America. So and North America was a sort of a testing ground because there were no humans, and then suddenly there were humans, and it's very well known when those appeared. And so it's a good template for. By this point, I don't think there are many people that are sort of very idealistic about if we go to the old ways of which we were, then everything will be fine, because the old ways are exactly these ways of sort of like exhausting and running to the limits, right? And I think that now we have run to the limits, but the limit now is their planet. And I think that's what has happened this time, that we've sort of expanded our industry and civilization to the point where the entire compact planet is relevant. It's the planetary scale is now relevant. And I think we need to be sort of cleverer than our ancestors that got to a valley. They saw some megafauna grazing around, and they thought, okay, we have a lot of food here. We're gonna be well off for a few generations, and they were. But then when they killed all the megafauna, they had to move away to another valley. Our problem is that we don't have another planet, right? So
right. Yeah,
that's kind of the perspective I would take intuitively.
Okay, great, thank you.
Well, we've covered a lot. I was just trying to write some notes about the breadth of our conversation so far, and I'm not sure I've even scratched the surface of it.
Right.
But let's go into the imaginary trips. So time travel.
Yep.
This is a question that unlocks a lot of creativity in our conversations. Do you think it's possible to travel in time? Is it feasible in only one direction, forward or backward? And regardless of whether it's possible, if it were possible and you could take a time trip, where would you go and why?
These are fascinating questions. I have to first just acknowledge this is the typical question that some of my friends, in an early evening will ask, and we'll run until 3 a.m. just
right
reminiscing and imagining. So I like this exercise myself a lot, just to bring myself back to a time. So okay, so I'll go one at a time. So time travel, is it possible in general? I think the overwhelming consensus as with modern physics is yes, in the sense that time is not absolute. And I guess the technical answer is yes. That's why it's a resounding yes, but it's perhaps not what people in the popular culture of time travel people think of. And I think one piece of popular culture that does reflect time travel, quote unquote, time travel more or less accurately is Interstellar, the movie, because it presents sort of time dilation, which is in a way subjectively for humans would be perceived as time travel in a way, because you would have a phenomenon, as the movie illustrates, that what was 23 years for someone was a few hours for others. So that is effectively time travel. And for if you think of the people who went for 6 hours and then came back to where this person was, there had been 23 years in the 6 hours they were gone. So effectively they traveled 23 years into the future in that context. Sort of the relativity of time and the sort of dynamics of what extreme speeds and extreme gravitational forces do to space and time, it creates the situation where it's actually factual that you could have the subjective experience of time travel in this sense. I would say it would only be forwards oriented. So you could only really have sort of, because it's time dilation, it's not time warping in a way. So you can only sort of stretch and compress the duration of time, but time is always pointing forward. You can't go back in that way. So this is sort of my physics training speaking, right? I'm not, do I think that it might be possible to have something like a closed temporal loop? I actually think physically this is possible. So it might be possible that you're living in effectively what is a loop in time. So there's no before or after in a way. So there's only time flowing. And so this is not really negating much of known laws of physics. And in fact, one even could make the argument that a system that is isolated and is fully reversible, like an atom that is just oscillating on its own in the vacuum, it's in some kind of time loop, because there's no way to discern, in what state it was after one cycle of vibration or whatever. So, but then again, that's a technical answer to say maybe there can be an arrangement in which many complex dynamics happen. So something like as complex as a human being having experiences and so on might be in a loop. So those experiences might actually be circular in a way, and subjectively you're always going forward. But then there's the whole question of the arrow of time, which has to be mentioned here, which seems to be a very strong pattern that we've observed in reality. So the answer is, eventually, I don't think we will ever see something like time travel in the near future, in the near technological future, because there's too much consistency for the pattern of the time, the arrow of time. Arrow of time, for the listeners, very briefly, is this idea that the laws of physics seem to be irreversible. They seem to not specify whether you can go forwards or backwards. In a way, if you rewind the laws of physics, they will look the same, but just going backwards. So there's no real distinction of whether you run time positive direction or negative direction. You can both look the same. But in reality, the combination of there's different theories here, but the combination of uncertainty to know exact positions of your system, or the parameters being approximate, or the myriad of parameters that are necessary, some combination of these things creates the sense that the majority of states dominate over the minority of states, and that's the idea of entropy increasing. And this is something that probably a lot of people are familiar with, the second law of thermodynamics and so on. But that's effectively just the phenomenon that we seem to observe, that things go forward and we age, and things break and they don't ensemble spontaneously. But when you analyze the energetics of spontaneous assembly, it's the same as the disassembly. This is the same energetic process, but it doesn't happen, or at least we don't observe it. We think that it's because it's so unlikely for it to happen that we will statistically never observe it. So I think those two things combined, the fact that we observe the universe being quite topologically flat, in a sense, we don't see, we don't live near some astronomical cataclysm that is warping space and time. I mean, who knows if you go there what happens? I mean, I'm sure that some weird things are happening in the nucleus of galaxies and things like that, I'm sure. But around in our neighborhood of sort of spatio-temporal stability, and together with the arrow of time, I think it's quite safe to say that traveling into the past is going to be a physical impossibility. But it's an extremely fun thought experiment.
Well, all right. So that's probably a more comprehensive explanation of time and the possibility of time travel than we've had
the
today.
Most technical, yes, for sure.
Awesome. It's also understandable by a layperson like me to a certain extent, which is also awesome. Now, the next question: where or when would you go if you could go?
Yes. Well, I'm gonna take the license as a sort of payment for that technical explanation to choose 3 different times instead of one.
Okay.
So
breaking the rules, Carlos. Breaking the rules.
So I take the license because they are chosen for three different reasons. So in terms of purely sort of aesthetics of witnessing something happening. So if I had a spaceship and I could just go in a pod and I had sort of a window that I could look out and be in the presence of something, I would love to see when the universe became transparent. So basically, when it transitioned from being so dense that light is not free to when it becomes free, because effectively you would see the first phenomenon of seeing something, and it would be a very interesting sight. If it were just a flash or something, it would not be very interesting, but you would see what then will become the structure of galaxies and everything that will happen. So it would be like glimpsing reality for the first time in a way. And because I am a very visual person, I like a lot of sort of visual art, and I'm very moved by visual input and very sort of shape moved. Just being able to see the first ever shapes in the universe, I think that's an interesting time. So I don't know, actually, at one point I knew the date, but it was some in the order of minutes since the Big Bang. But of course, these are very warped timescales, so don't take that figure too seriously. But yeah, that would be one. the other, if I listen to my my inner child, I would love to see a dinosaur ecosystem. I mean, I would just love to see, maybe a late Cretaceous, valley with sauropods and, the carnivores in the fringes and like the pterodactyls in flying above. Like, I would love to see a sort of a thriving dinosaur ecosystem with these titans, that are like towering over me and
Right.
like they're all alive and they have their sounds. And I mean, that would have been absolutely.
Oh, yeah. And you would know what color they were.
Oh yeah, and the sort of feather patterns, if they had any feathers and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And yeah, I was actually very fortunate, just a side note, when I was in Edinburgh to listen to one of the sort of cutting edge talks on the understanding of Tyrannosaurus, the T-Rex, very popular dinosaur. And the rendering they had is that they mostly probably were covered in feathers. And so suddenly when I saw a Tyrannosaurus covered in feathers, I mean, these are sort of proto feathers, so they are almost like fur. In a way. So when you saw the artist impression of that, suddenly it looked like a real animal. Like before, it felt like it's sort of like a lizard, a fantastical lizard that lived in the past, but that looked almost like a mane, and so it looked like an alpha predator, and that would display the mane. And anyway, so I would love to see sort of go on an adventure in a dinosaur ecosystem, in 70 years, million years ago. And then if I were to choose another point in the past, I think I would choose 18th century Europe. I would. I think you can see a keyboard in the background over there. I play the keyboard. I play harpsichord music. I love Baroque music, but I also love generally the intellectual atmosphere that was happening in the sort of Enlightenment era, where all these intellectuals were coming together for the first time and sharing these humanist values. And there was it was a very naturally multidisciplinary era as well, because I mean, the disciplines were not so formed, and it was a case of disciplines not being there, so that the things were naturally transdisciplinary just because of the history of the disciplines themselves. So I would love to see. I like to think of a particular figure I love is Émile du Châtelet. She was a prodigy, a French woman that lived in the 18th century, first half of the 18th century. She's famous for having translated Principia Mathematica, Newton's Principia Mathematica, into French, and have put it into a form that was much more approachable, that was less arcane than the Latin and the sort of geometry style of Newton. And she is the one that's credited for having invented the concept of kinetic energy, which has been used a lot. So she's a hero of mine. She's an absolutely amazing figure. If you go read Wikipedia article or some biography or something, she's amazing. And she sang opera. She spoke several languages. She was the very young wife of the, I think it was the Duke of Châtelet, some French aristocrat that basically allowed her to be herself, and they didn't really live a married life. They sort of, he said was very respectful and said, you can go on and live your life as long as we keep the appearances for the elite. And so she did all these gatherings where all the famous names, Voltaire and Maupertuis and all these people were
a salon. So she had a salon, like
exactly. Well, she had a castle that the Châtelet castle, and then she hosted this physics, arts, philosophy gatherings, and she had all these resources. And it's obviously before the French Revolution. It's the aristocracy that was extremely, from a sociological point of view, was extremely unfair for all the peasants that were in dire times. But if I want to think of something that is romantically, what I would love to see is these instances where the science that we know today was being formed for the first time. And I like to romanticize about that era as they're talking about whether kinetic energy makes sense at all, but then they move and they play some Baroque music on their harpsichords and their instruments, and they sing, and then they have all this art and architecture around them and their costumes and everything. So I like to ruminate a lot of that. So yeah, that would be my other choice.
This is very cool. When I had the opportunity to meet Harry Kroto and listen to him talk, he was, of course, one of the 3 Nobel Prize winners for the discovery of the buckyball. He talked about his inspiration from art, his study of art, his allowing himself to have his mind moved by art. And that was part of what energized him to study space dust which is what led to his collaboration with Bob Curl and Rick Smalley. Now, they ultimately looked aside from space dust because they saw this phenomenon of the 60 atom carbon molecule. But what I'm talking about is the transdisciplinary approach of one person. And what you've just described in your desire to travel in time is back to basics. It's all about fundamentals. It's about the beginnings of things. So the beginnings of the scientific disciplines at a time when someone could be a master of all disciplines if he or she were bright enough. And then we know from history how things went into specialization. And what you're forming with your colleagues is an effort with current tools to bring us back to the point of enabling creativity in ways that have been somewhat stunted by specialization. So that is really, in a sense, a summary of the whole conversation we've had. You've talked about things from numbers, whether they come from nature or human minds, or are they a construct of human beings. Talked about the potential power of bringing back essentially transdisciplinary efforts. And I was especially interested in what you said about the way to bring bright people who are specialists in their areas together in a way that they do actually achieve transdisciplinary conversation is to give them a big challenge, a challenge that's bigger than anybody, or give them a problem to solve in something that's so fundamental that everyone has to approach it as a child, but with all of their adult abilities in place. It's really one of the most interesting conversations I think we've had in Vision 2222. Whether we have to break it up into two parts, I don't know. We'll see.
Well, I mean, I feel very flattered for that. And thank you very much. It was really a pleasure to be here and to share my thoughts.
Well, if people want to get in touch with you, tell us how they need to do that.
Yes, I would say you can find me at Zapata-Carratala, my handle, so my surname. But I think if you want to find me, you just go to arity.science. That's the easy website where all my sort of intellectual profile is out. I am currently part of the Wolfram Institute. So if you find the Wolfram Institute, you will find me because I'm a very visible face there. We host live streams and so on. And then by all means, if you're interested in the topics of transdisciplinarity and sort of events of different disciplines coming together and sort of addressing fundamental questions and hard challenges, Society for Multidisciplinary and Fundamental Research is the place to also find me. So that's semf.org.es. And there you can find everything, and you can search for SEMF on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and you will find us on all those platforms.
And awesome. people will be able to find your podcast there as well on YouTube.
Yes, it's our YouTube channel. Yes, it's the same thing.
Awesome. Cool. Well, I think that brings us to an end. I want to thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Carlos. It was very, very exciting conversation. Really appreciate it. Very eye-opening and stimulating.
Thank you, Carlos. I'm so happy you agreed and to come on as a recommendation from Esteban. And I'm just blown away at the conversation that we just had, and it's just remarkable topics. So thank you so much for the discussions.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Vision 2222. And if you enjoyed what you heard, please like, subscribe, and share with your friends. Our YouTube channel is called Vision 2222 Podcast, all one word. We're also on Podbean at vision2222podcast.podbean.com. Again, Vision 2222 Podcast is all one word. Thank you for listening to this episode of Vision 2222. And if you enjoyed what you heard, please subscribe, like, and share with your friends. Please also comment, and we'll do our best to respond.